30 Iranian fast attack craft, 1 United States Navy carrier strike group. On paper, the result looks obvious. But naval analysts who have modeled this scenario consistently reach a different and more unsettling conclusion. In this scenario, the disparity in technology would be challenged by the cold, hard mathematics of saturation. If this engagement were to occur in the constricted waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the primary question would not be whether the United States Navy possesses superior firepower, but whether that firepower can be dispensed fast enough to prevent a catastrophic impact on a high-value asset. Defense analysts have modeled this hypothetical engagement as a magazine depth problem. Every Arleigh Burke-class destroyer and Ticonderoga-class cruiser in a carrier strike group operates with a finite number of vertical launch system cells. These cells contain the Standard Missile 6, the Standard Missile 2, and the evolved Sea Sparrow missile. While these are some of the most capable interceptors in existence, they represent a fixed resource. In a hypothetical engagement where an adversary launches a multi-axis swarm of 60 or more low-cost targets, the defense is forced to make a series of rapid-fire calculations that test the very limits of the Aegis combat system. In this scenario, the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely utilize its asymmetric doctrine of ambush and swarm. This doctrine is not built around the idea of a fair fight or a conventional naval duel. Instead, it is engineered to exploit the geographic constraints of the Persian Gulf. In these waters, the distance between the Iranian coastline and the deep-water shipping lanes is often less than 20 miles. At 30 knots, a fast attack craft can close that distance in approximately 40 minutes. If that craft is armed with a short-range anti-ship cruise missile or even a heavy payload of explosives for a kinetic strike, the reaction time for a United States carrier strike group would be measured in seconds, not minutes. Wargame analysts suggest that the complexity of such an engagement is compounded by the cluttered environment of the Strait. On any given day, hundreds of civilian tankers, fishing dhows, and cargo ships transit these waters. If a swarm of fast boats were to hide within this civilian traffic, the United States Navy's ability to identify and engage threats at long range would be severely degraded. Rules of engagement would likely dictate that the strike group commander must verify a hostile act before opening fire. In this hypothetical, that delay is exactly what the swarm doctrine is designed to exploit. The central tension of this analysis lies in the effectiveness of the close-in weapon system, often referred to as the CIWS or Phalanx. This rapid-fire 20mm Gatling gun is the final line of defense for a United States warship. It is designed to shred incoming missiles or small boats that have bypassed the outer layers of Standard missiles and Sea Sparrows. However, the CIWS has a limited effective range and a limited ammunition draw. If 10 boats were to approach a single destroyer simultaneously from different headings, the system would be forced to prioritize targets sequentially, based on known capabilities. Analysts believe that even a perfect defensive system has a saturation point, a specific number of incoming threats where the mathematical probability of a leaker reaching the hull approaches 100%. If this scenario unfolded, the objective of the Iranian forces would likely be a mission kill. They do not necessarily need to sink a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier to achieve a strategic victory. They only need to damage its flight deck, its radar arrays, or its propulsion systems enough to force it to withdraw from the combat zone. This analysis examines the thin margin between a successful defense and a high-cost failure. It is a study of how quantity, when applied with specific doctrine, can become a quality all its own. Based on historical precedent and current military doctrine, neither side would enter this engagement lightly. The United States Navy maintains a high state of readiness specifically to counter these swarm tactics. Conversely, the Iranian leadership understands that a failed swarm attack would result in the near total destruction of their naval assets. This is why the scenario is so carefully studied. It is a high-stakes chess match played with billion-dollar warships and $100,000 fast boats. The outcome would likely depend on factors no model can predict with absolute certainty, such as the psychological pressure on a young tactical action officer or the environmental conditions of the Persian Gulf at 5:30 in the morning. To understand how a hypothetical engagement in the Strait of Hormuz would unfold, one must first analyze the specific capabilities and strategic philosophy of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, or IRGCN. Unlike the regular Iranian Navy, which operates larger, conventional frigates and corvettes, the IRGCN is built almost entirely for asymmetric littoral warfare. Their doctrine is not based on matching the United States Navy ship for ship. Instead, it is based on the principle of distributed lethality through mass. In this scenario, the adversary would not rely on a single silver bullet weapon, but on hundreds of small, fast, and difficult-to-track platforms. At the heart of this swarm doctrine are the fast attack craft and fast inshore attack craft. These vessels, such as the Zulfikar and the Siraj 1, are significantly smaller than any combatant in a United States carrier strike group. The Sarai 1, for instance, is based on a high-speed British racing boat design, capable of reaching speeds in excess of 55 knots. In a hypothetical engagement, these boats would likely be used as mobile launch platforms for short-range anti-ship missiles like the Nasr 1. While a single Nasr 1 missile might not possess the warhead capacity to sink a destroyer, it is more than capable of achieving a mission kill by destroying sensitive radar arrays or communications equipment. Analysts suggest that the IRGCN would likely deploy these assets in cells of 10 to 15 boats. Each cell would approach the carrier strike group from a different vector. This multi-axis approach is designed to force the Aegis combat system to split its processing power across 360 degrees of coverage. If 30 boats were to converge on a single point from 5 different directions, the defensive coordination required to neutralize every threat would be immense. Furthermore, some of these craft would likely be configured as suicide boats, packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosives and guided by remote link or a determined crew. In this scenario, the objective is to find a gap in the strike group's outer screen and exploit it through sheer speed and persistence. The greatest strength of the Iranian swarm lies in its low-cost, high-risk nature. The loss of 20 fast boats and 40 sailors is a tactical setback for the IRGCN, but it is not a strategic disaster. Conversely, the heavy damage or loss of a single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, a ship costing approximately $2 billion, with a crew of over 300, would be a significant strategic blow to the United States. This economic and psychological asymmetry is the foundation of Iranian naval planning. Doctrine indicates that the IRGCN would be willing to accept 90% casualties in a swarm if the remaining 10% could successfully strike a high-value target. However, this doctrine also possesses inherent and significant weaknesses. The fast boats of the IRGCN are almost entirely unarmored. A single hit from a 20mm CIWS round or a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun would likely result in the total destruction of the craft. Furthermore, these boats lack advanced electronic warfare suites. If the United States Navy were to deploy high-powered electronic jamming, the IRGCN commanders would likely struggle to coordinate their movements or maintain targeting locks for their missiles. Without the ability to communicate, the swarm could quickly dissolve into a series of disconnected dollars, uncoordinated attacks that are much easier for a modern warship to pick apart. Another critical limitation is endurance and sea state. These small craft are designed for the relatively calm, shallow waters near the Iranian coast. In higher sea states, their speed is significantly reduced, and their weapon systems become much less accurate. Analysts believe that if the United States carrier strike group were to remain in deeper, more turbulent waters, the effectiveness of the Iranian swarm would drop precipitously. Despite these flaws, the IRGCN remains a professional force that has spent decades practicing these specific maneuvers. They are not an unorganized mob. They are a specialized tool designed for a specific geographic environment. In a hypothetical engagement, the IRGCN would also likely utilize land-based assets to supplement the sea-based swarm. This includes truck-mounted anti-ship missile batteries hidden in the rugged coastal mountains. By synchronizing a boat swarm with a land-based missile volley, the adversary would aim to create a saturation window where the number of incoming threats simply exceeds the number of interceptors. Available in the Strike Group's magazine. This integrated approach combining sea, land, and potentially even unmanned aerial vehicles is what makes the Iranian threat a credible challenge to United States naval supremacy in the region. To counter the asymmetric threat posed by a swarm, the United States Navy relies on a concept known as defense in depth. In this hypothetical engagement, a carrier strike group would not operate as a single ship, but as a coordinated ecosystem of sensors and shooters, all networked through the Aegis combat system. This system is designed to create a series of overlapping defensive bubbles that extend from hundreds of miles out, down to the very hull of the ship. However, while technologically superior, this defense is governed by the laws of physics and the limitations of magazine capacity. The outermost layer of this defense is the air wing. In a hypothetical scenario in the Strait of Hormuz, the carrier would likely maintain a combat air patrol consisting of FA-18 fighter jets and E-2D advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft. The Hawkeye acts as the eyes in the sky, using its powerful radar to look over the horizon and detect small surface craft, long before they can be seen by the ships below. If the engagement were to escalate, these aircraft, along with MH-60 Sierra helicopters, would serve as the first line of response. Armed with Hellfire missiles and 20mm cannons, the helicopters are particularly effective against small, fast boats. Analysis suggests that a single helicopter can neutralize several fast attack craft before they ever enter missile range of the strike group. The middle layer of defense is comprised of the escorting Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga-class cruisers. These ships are equipped with the AN/SPY-1 or the newer AN/SPY-6 radar systems, which are capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously. In this scenario, if the Iranian swarm were to launch a volley of anti-ship cruise missiles, the Aegis system would automatically prioritize the most dangerous threats. It would then deploy the Standard Missile 6 or the Standard Missile 2 to intercept them at long range. The Standard Missile 6 is a multi-mission interceptor that can engage both aircraft and surface ships, making it a versatile tool in a cluttered littoral environment. As the swarm closes the distance, the defense transitions to the point defense layer. This includes the evolved Sea Sparrow missile, or ESSM, and the rolling airframe missile, or AIR-AM. These systems are designed for high-speed, short-range intercepts of missiles that have bypassed the outer screen. The rolling airframe missile is particularly notable for its fire-and-forget capability, allowing it to engage multiple targets without requiring the ship's main radar to provide constant guidance. This is a critical advantage in a saturation attack, where the radar's processing power is being pushed to its limit. The final line of defense is the Close-In Weapon System, or CIWS. This radar-guided 20mm Gatling gun can fire at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. It is essentially a last-ditch system, intended to shred an incoming threat in the final seconds before impact. While highly effective in tests, analysts have noted a significant vulnerability: the keep-out zone. If an incoming missile is destroyed by the CIWS too close to the ship, the resulting debris and kinetic energy can still cause significant damage to the superstructure and sensitive electronics. Despite this formidable array of weaponry, defense analysts have identified a primary vulnerability: the magazine depth problem. Each destroyer has a fixed number of vertical launch system cells, typically 90 to 96. These cells must be shared between offensive Tomahawk cruise missiles, anti-submarine rockets, and defensive interceptors. In a hypothetical engagement where an adversary launches a multi-wave swarm of 60 boats and 40 land-based missiles, a destroyer could potentially exhaust its entire supply of standard missiles in a matter of minutes. Once those cells are empty, the ship cannot be reloaded at sea. It must return to a friendly port, effectively removing it from the combat zone. This creates what analysts call an unfavorable cost-exchange ratio. The United States Navy would be using a $2 million interceptor missile to destroy a $50,000 fast boat. In a prolonged engagement, the adversary would not need to win. They would only need to force the United States to shoot itself out of ammunition. Furthermore, the Aegis system, while sophisticated, has never been combat tested against a genuine multi-axis saturation attack of the scale Iranian doctrine calls for. Wargame models indicate that even with a 95% intercept success rate, the sheer volume of a swarm could allow 2 or 3 leakers to reach the target. In this analysis, the United States Navy is seen as a high-performance athlete capable of incredible feats, but with a limited lung capacity. The strength of the defense is its precision and range. Its weakness is its reliance on a finite and expensive inventory of interceptors. In the narrow confines of the Persian Gulf, where engagement distances are compressed, this technological advantage is put to its ultimate test against the raw weight of numbers. In this hypothetical engagement, the first phase would likely begin not with a bang, but with a series of ambiguous signals in the electromagnetic spectrum. As the United States Carrier Strike Group transits the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz, the tactical action officers aboard the cruisers and destroyers would observe a sudden spike in maritime traffic. In this scenario, the Iranian command would likely utilize gray zone tactics, interspersing their fast attack craft among civilian merchant vessels and fishing dhows to mask their radar signatures. This creates a significant identification challenge for the United States Navy, as doctrine emphasizes the importance of identifying a target as hostile before initiating a kinetic strike. Wargame models suggest that the engagement would likely open approximately 30 miles from the Iranian coastline. At this range, the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye would detect multiple high-speed surface contacts, emerging from coastal coves and military harbors. Based on known Iranian doctrine, these boats would not initially move in a straight line toward the carrier. Instead, they would likely adopt a dispersed radial approach, spreading out across the horizon to force the strike group's sensors to track dozens of individual points rather than a single cluster. Analysts believe this is intended to test the rules of engagement. At what point does a group of fast-moving boats become a verified threat? In this scenario, the Carrier Strike Group commander would likely initiate a series of non-kinetic escalations. This would include broadcasting warnings over international maritime distress frequencies and deploying MH-60 Sierra helicopters to intercept the lead elements of the swarm. These helicopters, flying low and fast, would utilize their Cougar missions to identify the boats and, if necessary, fire warning shots across their bows. However, in a coordinated Iranian attack, these warnings would likely be ignored. Analysis suggests that the Iranian crews would utilize the high speed of their vessels, often exceeding 40 or 50 knots, to close the distance rapidly, narrowing the decision window for the United States commanders. As the distance closes to 15 miles, the engagement would likely enter its first kinetic stage. If the Iranian fast boats were to illuminate the United States ships with targeting radars or uncover their missile launchers, the strike group would likely be authorized to defend itself. In this hypothetical, the first shots would likely be fired by the helicopters and the 5-inch deck guns of the destroyers. The objective of the United States Navy at this stage is interdiction, destroying the command and control boats and the missile-carrying craft before they can launch their primary salvos. Defense analysts have noted that the 5-inch gun, while powerful, has a relatively slow rate of fire compared to the number of potential targets in a 60-boat swarm. Simultaneously, the Iranian forces would likely initiate their own electronic warfare campaign. By using land-based jammers along the coast, they would attempt to degrade the data links between the United States ships and their airborne assets. If successful, this would force the strike group to rely on their organic shipboard sensors, which are more susceptible to the clutter created by the waves and the high-speed movement of the swarm. In this scenario, the atmosphere within the combat information center of a destroyer would be one of controlled intensity, as operators struggle to maintain a clear tactical picture amidst a blizzard of radar returns. Analysis indicates that the Iranian swarm would likely launch their first wave of short-range anti-ship missiles, such as the Nasr one, during this approach phase. These missiles, while less sophisticated than the heavy cruise missiles found on larger warships, are designed to fly at extremely low altitudes, skimming just a few feet above the water. This sea skimming profile makes them difficult to detect until they are very close to the target. If 30 boats each launch 2 missiles, the resulting volley of 60 incoming projectiles would represent a significant saturation threat. This is the moment where the Aegis combat system would transition to fully automatic engagement modes, firing Standard Missile 6 and evolved Sea Sparrow missiles in rapid succession. In this initial exchange, the cost of the engagement would already be evident. The United States Navy would likely neutralize a dozen or more fast attack craft in the first 10 minutes of the engagement. However, the sheer volume of the incoming missile volley would test the magazine depth of the escorts. Doctrine indicates that the strike group would attempt to maneuver into open water to increase the engagement range. But in the constricted waters of the strait, their options are limited. The Iranian forces, conversely, would likely accept high initial losses as the necessary price for getting their missiles into the air. This opening phase establishes the tone for the rest of the engagement. It is a battle of firsts. The first side to achieve a target lock, the first side to launch, and the first side to suffer damage. In this hypothetical analysis, the United States holds the technological advantage, but the Iranian swarm holds the initiative. As the first wave of missiles clears the horizon, the engagement shifts from a tactical problem to a survival problem for the ships in the screen. In this scenario, escalation would likely manifest as a sudden and massive expansion of the threat envelope, moving from a surface-only skirmish to a multi-domain saturation attack. Defense analysts suggest that as the initial wave of fast attack craft enters the inner defensive zone, the Iranian military would likely trigger their land-based coastal defense batteries. These systems, such as the Ghadir or Qadr long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, are often hidden in hardened, mobile launchers within the rugged terrain of the Iranian coastline. By synchronizing land-based launches with the maritime swarm, the adversary would attempt to achieve a time-on-target strike, where dozens of threats from different vectors arrive at the United States screen simultaneously. If this scenario were to unfold, the Aegis combat system would face its most significant challenge. Analysis indicates that the saturation threshold is not just about the number of missiles. but the number of radar illuminators available to guide interceptors. A single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer possesses 3 illuminators, while modern missiles like the Standard Missile-6 have active seekers and do not require constant illumination. The density of a 60-target attack would force the ship's computers to perform millions of calculations per second to manage the defensive fire. In this hypothetical engagement, the tactical action officer would likely be forced to authorize salvo fire, launching 2 interceptors for every high-threat incoming missile to ensure a kill. This would rapidly deplete the vertical launch system magazine. Doctrine indicates that as the density of incoming fire increases, the carrier strike group would likely deploy its soft kill measures. This includes the use of NOLCA active decoys and the AN/SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite. These systems are designed to seduce or jam the seekers of incoming Iranian missiles, making them miss the hull and fly harmlessly into the water. However, the effectiveness of these systems in a cluttered littoral environment is a subject of intense debate among naval planners. If the Iranian missiles are utilizing home-on-jam logic, they might actually be attracted to the very signals meant to confuse them. In this escalation phase, analysts believe the IRGCN would also deploy unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. These low-cost drones would not necessarily carry large warheads. Instead, they would be used as kinetic distractors or kamikaze platforms targeting the sensitive radar arrays and communication masts of the United States destroyers. If a single $10,000 drone were to impact the AN/SPY-1 radar array of a $2 billion ship, the ship would suffer a mission kill, effectively losing its ability to guide its standard missiles. This asymmetric exchange is a core tenet of the Iranian doctrine, aiming to degrade the strike group's eyes before the final wave of the swarm arrives. Wargame models predict that the pressure on the United States crews would be immense. In this hypothetical, the engagement would likely be occurring in a narrow corridor less than 20 miles wide. The ships would be maneuvering at high speeds, often in excess of 30 knots, while simultaneously launching missiles and firing 5-inch guns. The noise and vibration within the ship would be constant, and the physical fatigue on the sailors would begin to mount as the engagement enters its 2nd or 3rd hour. Based on known capabilities, analysts suggest that this is where human error could enter the equation. A single missed classification or a delayed launch command could result in a leaker penetrating the defense. Furthermore, doctrine would likely call for the carrier strike group to launch a counter-force strike. FA-18 fighter jets and F-35 Charlie aircraft would likely be vectored toward the Iranian coastline to hunt down the mobile missile launchers. However, this creates a secondary problem. The aircraft must fly through a layered air defense network consisting of S-300 or local Cordad-15 systems. This forced escalation. Moving the fight from the water to the land is exactly what the Iranian strategy seeks to provoke. By drawing the United States into a broader engagement, the adversary increases the complexity and the political cost of the conflict. The critical moment of escalation would occur when the magazine depth of the lead escorts falls below 50%. At this point, the strike group commander would face a harrowing decision: continue to hold the line and risk running out of interceptors, or begin a tactical withdrawal that leaves the aircraft carrier more exposed. In this scenario, the Iranian swarm would likely sense this hesitation and launch their final, most aggressive wave, including high-speed suicide boats that have been loitering under the cover of civilian traffic. Analysis suggests that the next 15 minutes would determine the survival of the strike group's integrity. In this scenario, the critical moment would likely arrive as the primary Iranian swarm crosses the 5-mile threshold. This is the kill zone, where the engagement shifts from a high-altitude missile duel to a frantic, low-altitude surface battle. Analysis suggests that this is the point where the strike group's technological superiority is most vulnerable to the raw physics of mass. At 5 miles, an Iranian fast attack craft, moving at 45 knots, would be less than 7 minutes from impact. If 30 separate boats are closing from multiple headings, the defense is no longer a matter of long-range precision, but of rapid-fire prioritization. Wargame models indicate that the turning point of the engagement would likely occur when the lead Arleigh Burke-class destroyer exhausts its immediate ready-to-fire evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, based on known capabilities. A destroyer might be engaging 5 to 10 incoming targets simultaneously. If a second wave of 10 boats emerges from behind a large civilian crude oil tanker used as a radar shield, the ship's tactical action officer would be forced to transition entirely to the close-in weapon system, or CIWS, and the rolling airframe missile. In this hypothetical, the sheer volume of the swarm begins to exceed the slew rate of the ship's gun mounts, the speed at which the weapons can physically turn from one target to the next. In this critical window, analysts believe a leaker would likely penetrate the screen. A leaker is a single, missile or a suicide boat that survives the layered defenses. If this scenario unfolded, the most probable outcome would be a mission kill on an escorting destroyer. If a single Nasser 1 missile or a fast attack craft laden with 500 pounds of high explosives were to impact the hull at the waterline, the ship would not necessarily sink. However, the shock of the explosion would likely shatter the sensitive cooling lines for the AN/SPY-1 radar and knock out the ship's primary power grid. This is the moment of maximum danger for the aircraft carrier. The loss of a single destroyer's radar coverage would create a blind sector in the strike group's 360-degree defense. Analysis suggests that the Iranian flotilla commander would likely have been trained to identify and exploit this exact gap. If one side of the defensive bubble collapses, the remaining escort ships must shift their positions to cover the whole, momentarily exposing their own vulnerable flanks. In this hypothetical engagement, the carrier itself, a target over 1,000 feet long, would now be within the visual range of the surviving fast boats. At this stage, the engagement would likely become a brawl. The carrier's own defense systems, including its RIM 162 Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles and rolling airframe missiles, would begin firing autonomously. Doctrine indicates that the carrier would also launch its remaining MH-60 Sierra helicopters in a desperate attempt to strafe the approaching boats with door-mounted machine guns and Hellfire missiles. The water would be filled with the smoke of burning vessels and the white wakes of high-speed maneuvers. Defense analysts have noted that in such a chaotic environment, the risk of friendly fire or blue-on-blue incidents increases exponentially as ships and aircraft struggle to distinguish between the enemy swarm and their own fleeing civilian traffic. The critical moment is defined by the interceptor gap. This is the 3 to 5 second delay between the destruction of one target and the acquisition of the next. In a vacuum, 3 seconds is nothing in a saturation attack. 3 seconds is enough time for an Iranian Siraj 1 to close another 200 yards. Analysts believe that the outcome of the entire engagement hinges on whether the United States Navy can maintain sensor fusion despite the loss of one or more radar nodes. If the network holds, the swarm can be methodically dismantled. If the network fractures under the pressure of the mission kill, the carrier itself could suffer a direct hit to its flight deck, effectively ending its ability to launch or recover aircraft. This moment represents the ultimate test of the Aegis combat system's design philosophy. It is where the mathematical models of the Pentagon meet the kinetic reality of the Strait of Hormuz. In this scenario, the bravery of the crews on both sides would be absolute. but the result would likely be decided by which side can endure the highest rate of attrition in the shortest amount of time. The engagement has now passed the point of no return. In this hypothetical engagement, the exchange phase would likely be characterized by a violent and rapid expenditure of munitions, resulting in significant losses for both sides. As the leakers identified in the previous phase penetrate the inner screen, the mathematical probability of a successful strike on a United States hull becomes a reality. Analysis suggests that the lead Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, having exhausted its primary interceptors, would likely suffer a direct hit from an Iranian anti-ship cruise missile. The impact would likely occur in the ship's superstructure, specifically targeting the sensitive radar arrays or the bridge. Based on known damage control models, the ship would not sink. Modern United States warships are designed with significant redundancy and advanced fire suppression systems. However, the kinetic energy of a missile, traveling at Mach 0.9, combined with the explosion of its 150-pound warhead, would likely result in a mission kill. In this scenario, the destroyer would be forced to withdraw from the formation, its combat systems offline and its ability to defend the carrier compromised. This represents a significant loss of defensive real estate for the strike group. Simultaneously, the cost to the Iranian swarm would be devastating. Analysis indicates that for every missile that reaches the screen, 12 to 15 fast attack craft would likely be destroyed. The combined fire from the carrier's air wing, the escorting ship's 5-inch guns, and the 25mm Bushmaster cannons would turn the water into a graveyard of fiberglass and metal. If 60 boats initiated the attack, defense analysts believe that fewer than 10 would survive the first 20 minutes of high-intensity combat. The Iranian crews, while professional and determined, would be facing the most lethal concentrated firepower in maritime history. In this scenario, the carrier itself would likely not escape unscathed. If the Iranian swarm synchronized its surface attack with a land-based missile volley, at least one leaker might reach the aircraft carrier. Analysis suggests that even a small missile or a suicide boat impacting the carrier's side would not threaten the ship's buoyancy. A 100,000-ton Nimitz-class or Ford-class carrier is essentially a floating fortress. However, an explosion near the waterline or on the flight deck could cause what analysts call operational degradation. This might include the destruction of several F-35 Charlie aircraft parked on the deck or the warping of an aircraft elevator, significantly slowing the carrier's ability to launch its counter-strike. The vulnerability of the United States Navy in this hypothetical is not its lack of armor, but its reliance on high-complexity electronics. A soft kill on the carrier's communication masts would be just as effective as a hole in the hull for the purposes of the Iranian objective. If the carrier cannot coordinate with its escorts or its airborne Hawkeye, the strike group's defense in depth ceases to exist. This highlights a critical lesson of modern naval warfare. The adversary does not need to destroy the platform to defeat the system. On the other side, the Iranian limitations would become glaringly apparent during the exchange. Once the initial shock and awe of the swarm is spent, the survivors have no way to reload or regroup under fire. Doctrine indicates that the IRGCN relies on a one-shot surge. If that surge fails to achieve a decisive breakthrough, the remaining boats are left exposed to the carrier's retaliatory power. In this scenario, the FA-18 fighters and MH-60 Sierra helicopters would likely pursue the fleeing survivors back to their coastal hideouts, using precision-guided munitions to ensure the threat is permanently neutralized. This exchange demonstrates the brutal efficiency of both doctrines. The Iranian swarm achieves its goal of bloodying the United States Navy, proving that even a superpower can suffer damage in the littoral zone. Conversely, The United States Navy demonstrates that, while it can be hurt, its capacity to absorb damage and deliver a crushing response remains unparalleled. The water of the strait would be littered with the remnants of the IRGCN's maritime strategy. But the deck of a billion-dollar United States warship would be burning. In this hypothetical engagement, the engagement would likely conclude within 90 minutes of the first kinetic exchange. The result would not be a clean, cinematic victory, but a sobering demonstration of the high cost of littoral combat. Based on wargame models, the United States Carrier Strike Group would likely remain in control of the waters, but its operational capacity would be fundamentally altered. The fog of war would begin to lift, revealing a tactical landscape that challenges the traditional notion of naval invulnerability. Analysis suggests that the primary Iranian swarm would be effectively annihilated. Out of the original 60 fast attack craft, defense analysts estimate that fewer than 5 would remain seaworthy. The remaining vessels would likely be forced to retreat into the shallow coastal inlets or be intercepted by United States MH-60 Sierra helicopters. However, for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, this near-total loss of platforms would likely be framed as a strategic success in this scenario. They would have achieved what few modern militaries have. They would have successfully penetrated the world's most advanced integrated air defense system and inflicted visible, significant damage on a United States Carrier Strike Group. The state of the United States forces would likely be the most analyzed aspect of the engagement. In this scenario, one Arleigh Burke-class destroyer would likely be a mission kill, while the hull would remain afloat due to advanced damage control and compartmentalization. Its ability to contribute to the fight would be zero. With its primary radar arrays shattered and its vertical launch system magazines nearly empty, the ship would require a tow or a slow, guarded transit out of the Persian Gulf. For a strike group that relies on every escort to provide 360-degree protection, the loss of this single node represents a critical vulnerability. The aircraft carrier itself would likely be operational but degraded. Analysts believe that in a saturation attack of this scale, at least one missile or a cloud of high-velocity debris from a CIWS intercept would have impacted the flight deck or the island superstructure. In this hypothetical, the carrier might still be able to launch aircraft, but at a significantly reduced rate. If an aircraft elevator were jammed or the flight deck scorched by a leak or impact, the strike group's primary offensive weapon, the air wing, would be hampered for days or weeks. This limited success by the adversary would force the United States Command to reconsider the safety of operating high-value assets in such confined waters. Losses on both sides would be specific and honest. In this analysis, the United States would likely suffer dozens of casualties among the crews of the damaged escort and the carrier's deck personnel. The loss of several FA-18 fighters or F-35 Charlie aircraft caught on the deck during the impact would also be a reality. Conversely, the Iranian losses would be measured in the hundreds. The high-risk nature of the swarm doctrine means that the majority of the personnel involved in the initial waves would not survive the encounter. However, in the logic of asymmetric warfare, the trade of 500 sailors and 60 cheap boats for the mission kill of a $2 billion destroyer is a trade the adversary is prepared to make. The engagement would likely end when the magazine depth of the entire strike group reaches a critical floor. Doctrine indicates that once the available interceptors fall below a certain percentage, the strike group commander would be forced to prioritize the safety of the carrier over the mission of dominating the strait. In this scenario, the United States forces would likely move toward the deeper, more open waters of the Arabian Sea, using their remaining long-range assets to maintain a cordon sanitaire around the mouth of the strait. The outcome, therefore, is a tactical victory for the United States. They held the field and destroyed the attacking force. but a strategic warning. The engagement would prove that while the Aegis combat system is remarkably capable, it is not an impenetrable shield against a determined and numerically superior swarm. The myth of the invincible carrier would be replaced by the reality of the survivable but vulnerable carrier. In the aftermath, the United States Navy would be left to count the cost of its ammunition and the scars on its hulls, while the region would be left to contemplate a new era of maritime volatility. In this hypothetical scenario, the engagement would likely yield 3 critical analytical lessons that would reshape modern naval doctrine. These findings represent the gap between theoretical capability and kinetic reality in a high-density littoral environment. Defense analysts believe that the most significant takeaway from this analysis is the magazine depth paradox, the reality that a technologically superior force can be defeated by the cold mathematics of attrition. The first lesson is the unfavorable cost-exchange ratio. In this scenario, the United States Navy would likely expend dozens of Standard Missile 6 and evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, each costing between $2 million and $4 million, to neutralize fast attack craft that cost less than $50,000. While the defense is effective at preserving the hull of the carrier, the strategic cost of the engagement is asymmetrical. Analysis suggests that an adversary does not need to win the tactical fight to win the economic one. If a carrier strike group is forced to withdraw because it has shot itself out of ammunition, the adversary has achieved its strategic objective of sea denial, without ever needing to match the United States in a conventional battle. The second lesson concerns the littoral identification challenge. Wargame models consistently show that the greatest threat to a carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf is not the enemy's speed, but the environment's complexity. In this hypothetical, the presence of hundreds of civilian merchant vessels acts as a form of passive camouflage for the swarm. Analysis indicates that the rules of engagement, which require positive identification before firing, create a hesitation window. If an Iranian fast boat can close the distance to within 5 miles before being classified as a combatant, the United States Navy loses its primary advantage, long-range engagement. This suggests that in future littoral conflicts, the speed of decision-making and the accuracy of automated target classification will be more important than the speed of the missiles themselves. The third and perhaps most sobering lesson is the fragility of high-complexity systems. This analysis has shown that a modern warship is a glass cannon in terms of its electronics. While an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is nearly impossible to sink with small-caliber weapons, it is relatively easy to mission kill. In this scenario, the destruction of a single AN/SPY-1 radar array or a satellite communication mast would effectively remove a $2 billion asset from the tactical network. Analysts believe that future ship designs may need to prioritize graceful degradation, the ability to continue fighting, even after primary sensors are destroyed, rather than relying on a single, centralized combat system like Aegis. For regional policy, this scenario indicates that deterrence is a fluid concept. If an adversary believes they can inflict visible damage on a United States carrier, the psychological threshold for escalation is lowered. This analysis suggests that the United States would likely respond by shifting toward more distributed lethality, utilizing smaller, unmanned surface vessels and long-range standoff weapons to keep high-value assets out of the swarm zone. The era of the carrier strike group operating with impunity in narrow straits would likely be replaced by a more cautious, standoff-oriented posture. Ultimately, this analysis is based on publicly available information regarding weapon systems and established naval doctrine. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict, such as environmental conditions, the specific electronic warfare environment of the day, and the human element under fire. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine. In the aftermath of such a hypothetical engagement, the strategic consequences would likely reverberate far beyond the physical wreckage in the Strait of Hormuz. While the United States Navy would likely have cleared the surface of threats, the operational reality of the mission-killed destroyer and the charred flight deck of the aircraft carrier would represent a seismic shift in global maritime perception. In this scenario, the primary casualty is not just hardware or personnel, but the long-held assumption that a carrier strike group can project power in the littoral zone with absolute impunity. Strategic analysts suggest that the political fallout in the United States would be immediate and severe. The sight of a multi-billion-dollar warship being towed into a friendly port, its advanced radar arrays shattered by low-cost munitions, would likely spark a fundamental debate in the halls of power. Defense planners would be forced to answer a difficult question. Is the concentration of so much national prestige and military capability into a single hull still viable in an era of mass-produced, high-speed asymmetric threats? If this scenario unfolded, the United States would likely accelerate its investment in distributable naval power, shifting focus away from a few massive platforms and toward a larger number of smaller, unmanned, and expendable vessels. In the region, the balance of power would undergo a complex recalibration. While the Iranian maritime swarm would have been effectively destroyed, the fact that it achieved kinetic hits on the world's premier naval force would likely be interpreted by other regional actors as a demonstration of asymmetric parity. Doctrine indicates that the successful mission kill of a destroyer would serve as a blueprint for other nations seeking to deny sea control to a larger power. The Hormuz model would likely be studied by any military force that finds itself outmatched in a conventional ship-for-ship comparison. Furthermore, the impact on global energy markets would be profound. In this hypothetical, the insurance rates for transit through the strait would likely skyrocket, effectively closing the waterway to commercial traffic for months. Even with the United States Navy maintaining a presence at the mouth of the Gulf, the proved vulnerability of warships would suggest that civilian tankers are essentially indefensible against a determined swarm. This would likely lead to a permanent shift in global energy logistics, with nations seeking to bypass the strait through new pipelines or alternative energy sources, fundamentally altering the economic importance of the region. The final lesson of this analysis is one of strategic humility. The United States would hold the strait, but at a price that would shock the American public and fundamentally change the calculus of future deployments in this region. This scenario demonstrates that in modern warfare, victory is no longer a binary state. It is a spectrum where the cost of winning can sometimes be as strategically damaging as the cost of losing. The Iranian swarm doctrine, while suicidal in a tactical sense, achieves its ultimate goal by making the price of intervention unacceptably high. This analysis is based on publicly available information regarding current weapon systems, observed naval exercises, and established military doctrines. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict, including the specific timing of the engagement, the local weather conditions, and the split-second decisions of the crews involved. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military doctrine, intended to provide an objective look at the evolving challenges of 21st century naval combat.